Hello and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar RPG podcast. I am Clayton, and before we get started, you can find show notes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/alienfamiliar. And if you would like to help the show out by supporting it, you can do so at patreon.com/alienfamiliarmedia, where if you enjoy our content and would like to help us out with hosting costs, any help you would be able to give us would be greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining me today. Today it's just me, and I am going to be reviewing the new, as of the recording of this podcast. By the time this podcast comes out, it'll be a couple weeks after release, but I'm going to be reviewing Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, the new Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition supplement that just came out recently. To start off, I need to disclose that I have been a huge fan of Ravenloft ever since I started getting into tabletop role-playing games and discovered that this setting called Ravenloft, this horror D&D setting, existed. So for probably about 20 years now, I've been a pretty big fan of Ravenloft. My first introduction to it was the 3rd edition supplement published by Sword and Sorcery, I want to say. That was my first introduction to Ravenloft, and since then I've gone back and read a little bit in the of the 2nd edition books, but having played in a Curse of Strahd game in 5th edition, I've been looking forward to the release of this book ever since it was announced, Ravenloft being one of my favorite campaign settings. As soon as I got it, I started reading it, and I pretty much read through most of the book in the course of just a few days. A couple sections I skipped because I don't typically read over in great detail things like the new classes and stuff like that. When it comes to subclasses, I really don't care about them until I'm actually playing the main class, and then I start just looking through what subclasses are available, and even then I barely really look at the stats associated with the subclass. I just look at the flavor before I decide whether or not I want to play a particular class or particular subclass. So if you're looking for whether or not these new subclasses are particularly powerful, or whether the new races are particularly powerful, I'm not the person to talk to about that. So I'm just going to basically go through the book section by section, particularly talking about the sections that really spark interest in me, and we'll just go from there. So before I actually get into the book, I want to say that this particular book is, in fact, a campaign setting. It's not a player's option. It's not, it is full of GM tools, but at its core, this book is the equivalent of the Wayfinder's Guide to Eberron, or the Wildemount book, or any of the other campaign settings that have come out for D&D 5th edition, Theros, Ravnica. It's very much structured in the same way that those supplements are. So if you're familiar with the layout of those, you will be very familiar with the layout of this book. Chapter 1 starts off with talking about the 7 secrets of Ravenloft. I really like how D&D has been putting these, usually 10 or fewer main points about the setting that it covers just a few paragraphs, so that if you are getting ready to run this game for a group of players who are not at all familiar with it, they have a very short handout that you can print out for them, and they can read it and have a fairly decent grasp on what to expect from the campaign setting. That it doesn't give a lot of detail about the campaign setting, but it just gives an idea of the tone and the feel, and what can be expected, what types of adventures can be expected to happen within the campaign setting. And even whenever I'm not playing a D&D game or a D&D setting that has something like this printed out, I've been using that in my games. I put out a bullet point list of the major information about the setting. Like for instance, whenever I run a Savage Worlds game, I will do up basically a version of this where it is your character's common knowledge, what you would know about the setting without even having to roll your common knowledge skill for, or a different D&D setting without even have to roll any sort of history roll to know kind of what's going on in the world at the time. It gives a little bit of information about the dark powers, and I really like how they're continuing with the tradition of not giving any actual hard information or stats about the dark powers. It's very vague about what they actually are. It gives some suggestions about what they could be, but it leaves you up to the DM to decide what exactly the dark powers are, if that's even going to be a part of the campaign. Personally, I think that Ravenloft works better with that huge unknown of what the dark powers are. I don't even think that players new to the setting should even be aware that the dark powers exist until they get probably mid-tier, before they start hearing little hints about it. And then after a little bit about the dark powers, it gives some information about the mists, how the structure of the domains work, how the Dark Lords work, and then it goes into actual player character information in the next chapter, or chapter 1. I guess I was going over the introduction. So in chapter 1, we start going into the heroes themselves, giving some information about how to let your players know. It starts with advice on being a character in a horror setting, and there's a lot of really much needed advice in here about how to be a good player. It gives it in the context of how to be a good horror character, but it's very easy to modify some of this information to be, this is how you make a good character who is going to fit with the themes of a particular campaign, or just how to be a good player in and of itself. Pieces of advice such as enjoy the struggle. As particularly with brand new players, a lot of brand new players, they have this mindset of, I want to play my character and I want my character to be this perfect thing that doesn't make any mistakes. I've seen that happen a lot. And it encourages new players to make characters who aren't perfect. They aren't Mary Sue's. And I think that's a big thing that, I think that's an important part of making interesting characters, is making characters who aren't just good at everything or just absolutely perfect at the thing that they do. Make them with some dimension, make them with some flaws, some depth. So after the little bit of information about how to create a character specific for this type of campaign, that goes into some what is essentially the new races, but here they are called lineages. I would consider this more along the lines of back in 3rd edition, where you had templates that you could apply to player characters or monsters. This is a set of rules that go on top of the existing character. So for an example, the first lineage listed here is the Dhampir. This is a half vampire, and you can make a half vampire who isn't just human. You could make a half vampire that is elven or any of the other player character races. You can even have a Dhampir who is based on a half elf, so a half elf. And like I said, I'm not going to go into great detail about the different races, just because I personally don't look at the stats, and I don't really care what the stats are. The flavor is what really grasps me about these, and who in the hell hasn't want to play a half vampire at some point, especially if you've seen the movies, Vampire Hunter D or, its sequel, Bloodlust. After that comes the Hexblood. The Hexbloods are a race that is in some way infused with fell fae magic. Most often, your character was born as a result of some tampering with hags most of the examples given in the book are a couple of parents will go to a hag because they are having trouble conceiving a child, and so the hag will perform this ritual that will give them a child, and inevitably the child that is born has this hex blood in them. Their blood is tainted by the fell magic that was used to create them. And it's also available as something that your character takes on later in life. So, for instance, I personally might have gone with a hexblade I've talked about my character, Wade the Wizard, on the last episode that we did, of the character I played in Ravenloft. If this source book had been available a year ago, Wade probably would have been a hexblood because it fits perfectly with what I had in mind for my character of Wade. After the Hexblood, we have the Reborn. This can be either your character is a sort of Frankenstein's monster, was brought back by not using magic, but by using some sort of technological or technomagical means. It can also be that your character was brought back by some sort of magic. I played a character, I don't remember whether or not I mentioned this character on the last episode, favorite characters, but I played a character called Wake in a 4th edition game that was, in the 4th edition rules, a Revenant. And now with the Reborn lineage here, I could absolutely recreate that character without any difficulty. The Reborn are deathless. They have a lot of the same strengths as being undead. The same thing with the Dhampir. They have a lot of the strengths of being undead, but they aren't fully undead. You are still a humanoid whenever it comes to the different powers and things that can affect you. After those 3 lineages, we get into some of the dark gifts that are available. The dark gifts are expansions of the dark gifts that were first introduced in Curse of Strahd. If your characters, spoiler alert, had ever gotten to the Amber Temple and had gotten very deep into that, you might have been presented with some potentials for some dark gifts. These dark gifts in here are a little bit more broad. They're designed to be available for characters. Even during character creation, you could take on one of these dark gifts and it wouldn't be game breaking, whereas the ones in Curse of Strahd, some of them were a little bit powerful. In Curse of Strahd, not to give out any, well, I've already said spoilers, so the dark gifts is how Strahd came to be, how he became a vampire. So this is definitely a little bit more toned down, and more than just being a power that you get with some consequence. There are a lot of really good ideas in here about different ways that the negative portion of the dark gift can be manifest. And really, this is just a lot of really good jumping off points. I'm going to say this time and time again throughout this book, that there's so much in here that is a good jumping off point for GMs who are wanting a spark of inspiration. There's so much in here that whenever I was reading it, it immediately made me want to run a Ravenloft game. And that's the mark of a good campaign setting, is that you read it and you're just consumed by the desire to run this particular game. And there are a couple of dark gifts in here that I want to draw particular attention to. If anybody has ever wanted the desire to play a character along the lines of Venom or Carnage or any of the other symbiotes from the Spider-Man comics or Spider-Man spin-off comics, there is a particular dark gift on here where you do acquire a symbiotic being. And I know I'm probably going to be constantly referring to old characters that I've played in the past where this type of thing would have worked absolutely perfect for. And this is another thing that would have worked absolutely perfect for another character that I had played in the past because I had something very similar to that particular character. This was an Eberron game where I was playing a half-orc wizard named Narlath, who was, if I were to translate him into 5th edition, he would have been a warlock of the Great Old Ones. And eventually his familiar became a part of him and his familiar just basically lived underneath his skin. If you've ever seen, the original Hellboy movie, the idea for Rasputin where you saw this tentacle thing writhing underneath the skin of the villain Rasputin in Hellboy, that was what I had in mind for that character. And symbiotic being can manifest as something exactly like that, where it's just this creepy little thing and you've got this extra voice inside of your head talking to you constantly. The type of thing that I just absolutely love. After the Dark Gifts come the subclasses. The new subclasses are the Bard College of Spirits and the Warlock Patron of the Undead. Again, I really can't tell whether or not this is something that is very powerful, how well it balances with the other Bard and Warlock subclasses, but these are definitely something that, based on the flavor alone, it's something that I would love to play at some time. Back in 3rd edition, there was a bardic prestige class in Libris Mortis called the Dirge Singer. I always wanted to play a Dirge Singer, and if I were to play a 5th edition version of that, I would absolutely be playing this Bard College of Spirits. The Warlock with the Undead Patron, I understand that there was a release on the Wizards of the Coast website that was basically a preview or a playtest of this Undead Patron, and now we're seeing it in print. I don't know what the differences are. I never really looked at the playtest version of it. But there you go. If you want to play a Warlock who has as his patron Strahd or somebody else, the vampire Koss, or you want to go into some older D&D lore, the Vestige of Tenebris, I want to say is what it was called, back the old Planescape adventure of Dead Gods, that character you could play where you are a devotee of any of these types of characters. Then we get into the backgrounds. I'll be honest, I find backgrounds so formulaic that while the specific abilities that are granted with a background I find interesting, the majority of the background I just don't find interesting. I like being able to gain the extra very minor ability that goes with most of the backgrounds and just kind of flavor it my own way, so that I have this it's usually a cool out of combat social ability that you have that just kind of helps to flavor your character and kind of gives you guidance for how you might want to play that character whenever they're interacting with NPCs or with a small village or a town, how they react to you whenever you arrive. There are some additional information for specifically horror-related character personality traits, character ideals, bonds, and flaws. Again, just more jumping off points for your characters. There are some additional specific background abilities related to haunted ones, investigators, types of things. Again, not really something that gets me excited anyway. Backgrounds are just things that kind of fall into the background for me. After backgrounds, we have horror trinkets. So I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here and ask, why are there so many goddamn trinket lists in D&D 5th edition? Does anyone actually use these? I saw this and I thought back about all the previous trinket lists that I've seen, and it seems to take up so much real estate in D&D 5th edition books, and it's something I never use. I did a little bit of research into it, and I calculated how many pages have been used in printed books for trinkets, and there are 7 physical printed D&D books with trinket lists in them. And that is longer than some of the chapters in the original Player's Handbook. It's longer than the personality and background check section in the Player's Handbook. Hell, the trinket list in the original Player's Handbook takes up more real estate than the discussion about alignment in 5th edition. Personally, I feel like the trinkets are a place where D&D 5th edition is putting a lot of misplaced energy. Maybe there's a lot of campaigns out there where the trinkets play a bigger role, but personally, I've maybe rolled on the trinket table a couple of times, if that. I know for a fact I've rolled at least once, maybe twice. And to put all of this information into these books about trinkets that more often than not, if you are rolling on it, it's something that is immediately forgotten, or if it's rolled on later on in the campaign as like something of what, as a loot item, it's immediately considered junk. I've never seen it come up in play as anything other than junk. So I don't know why this continues to get put into the game. Okay, rant done. Trinket list rounds out chapter 1. Chapter 2 starts going into how to create the domains of dread. And it starts with how to create a Dark Lord, and then goes into how to create a domain. And particularly the how to create a domain is probably the section that I think I'm going to use the most as a GM. It's chock full of great GM advice on designing a horror campaign specifically, but you can very easily translate it into how you can design a campaign in general. And I feel like that's information that really isn't expanded on anywhere in D&D 5th edition. The nuts and bolts of how to craft a story from beginning to end, how to craft a long arcing story that takes place over multiple adventures, multiple sessions. That information is in here, and I feel like it's information that has been very sorely lacking in 5th edition. I'm really glad that it's in here because this information is really, really good. After how to create a domain, it goes into some explanation as to what some of the different genres of horror are. Things like body horror, cosmic horror, dark fantasy, folk horror, ghost stories, gothic horror, disaster horror, occult, detective stories, psychological horror, slasher horror. Just a lot of really good jumping off points that's designed to spark your imagination and spark your ideas for how you're going to create a particular campaign and how to tie themes together, how to tie a bunch of different adventures together by having the same elements return time and time again, and create a through narrative, create a through tone, create something that whenever your players are playing, they're going to immediately pick up on, and if your players are good, they can expand on that and kind of play into the type of subgenre that you are playing. Chapter 3 goes into the actual domains themselves. Starts off talking about how the mists work, and then goes into talking about some information about Barovia it really expands what's in Curse of Strahd, because Curse of Strahd, all of the information about Barovia is kind of presented as part of that narrative. This gives more generic information about Barovia, so that if you wanted to, you could create your own adventure set in Barovia for Curse of Strahd. And then we go into other domains of dread. A lot of the main ones, their information is spread out over Generally 3 to 5 pages is given to each of the major domains of dread. And by major, I mean the ones that appeared in the previous editions of the campaign settings of Ravenloft. There's a couple new ones, but they're all really, really good. And there's a spread of probably the ideal levels at which you would interact with these particular domains of dread. And some of the larger domains of dread are designed so that players can start at low level and go actually pretty high level before they would actually interact with the Dark Lords. And some of them are designed so that you could interact with the Dark Lord directly and potentially overcome the Dark Lord at relatively low levels, probably like level 5 or 6 or 7 are probably some of the levels that the player characters could do a direct confrontation with some of these Dread Lords. There's also a lot of information in here that leads me to think that I would love to play a campaign just set in one of these considered low-level domains, dread domains, where the player characters spend a lot of time, and hell, maybe you don't even tell your players that this is a Ravenloft game, that this is a game set within the domains of dread. To follow the advice in Chapter 1, it advises that you always tell your players that you're playing in a horror game and kind of get a feel for whether and how they feel about that. And there's, to kind of go back a little bit, there's also some information about using the X card in 5th edition. The X card being something that has existed in several different game systems, and basically it is a method by which a player who becomes very uncomfortable and is potentially psychologically triggered by some type of content, it allows that player to let the GM know that, hey, this type of thing is beyond what I'm comfortable dealing with. I like the idea of using it. I haven't had much opportunity to use something like the X card because I haven't always had players who feel that an X card would be needed, particularly in a group that I'm not familiar with the players. I think that using an X card would be a very good addition to the game, just because I, as a GM, I don't know how far I can go. I don't know the different players well enough to know what their triggers might be. I mean, I don't want to accidentally stumble upon some sort of trauma that a player has experienced in their life and cause that player to have a really bad day. So the X card is great for trying to avoid that, or maybe not avoid it, but whenever it starts to come up, they can give a signal to basically curb the story away from something that might be traumatic for them. There are a couple of things in here that are really, really nice nods to not only old material for Ravenloft, but also nods, I'm pretty sure, to people who are very, very versed in D&D lore. You might see a couple of names in here from other campaign settings that weren't originally part of Ravenloft. Of particular note, where I'm also a big fan of Planescape. There is a Planescape character who shows up in one of, like, very briefly. They're literally in one sentence, but whenever I read it, it gave me a little bit of joy to see that character is still continuing to show up in D&D editions, even though, unfortunately, Planescape is probably never going to be recreated in another D&D setting just because of the nature of Planescape. But enough about Planescape. This review is not for Planescape. This is for Ravenloft. So after the main domains of dread, the big ones sometimes the big ones are big geographically, and sometimes the big ones are big conceptually. Like, there is one domain of dread that is in here that is given 3 pages, and the amount of space that the domain takes up is the size of a circus. It is a traveling circus that goes from place to place, and this is potentially a way for your characters to travel to other domains of dread, and it is also a potential way to bring your characters into Ravenloft, and it's also potentially a way for Ravenloft to visit one of the other campaign settings, or a homebrew setting that you have set up. There's a lot of really good things in here about how to incorporate Ravenloft into an existing campaign setting. Just kind of have your characters fall into one of these places. And after talking about the specific domains themselves, the major domains, then there are a few domains that really don't get a lot of print space. These are more like just, again, jumping off points to give some ideas of how you might construct a domain of dread. There are, over the course of 4 or 5 pages, 6 pages, there's some domains that are given information in just a paragraph or two. Some of these are in and of themselves very small domains. Some of them are just ideas for having a big campaign, but with very little information to go off of, so that the GM can just have free reign to create whatever they want. So if a player happens to have the Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, you could run a game in, for instance, in the domain related to Kos, the Bloody-Handed, who is the vampire who cut off the hand and cut out the eye of the Lich Vecna. You could have an entire campaign setting set in that domain of dread, and the players have, even if you have a player who has read all of Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, they wouldn't know what to expect at all, because there's hardly any real information given in this book about that particular domain. And I really liked that there were a couple of domains that were added for other campaign settings. There is one related to Eberron that I immediately noticed, because it has to do with the destruction of Seer and the creation of the Mournland in Eberron. After the domains, you get some information about different organizations in the domains of dread that kind of span the different domains. Some of them are ones that are introduced in Curse of Strahd, particularly the Keepers of the Feather, which are an extension of the Were Ravens. And then there's a little bit more information about the Vistani. And then there are some really cool NPCs that you can add in. Some of them are characters from Curse of Strahd, or introduced in Curse of Strahd, such as Van Richten himself. Esmeralda is in here. And while we're talking about the NPCs, I want to say that one of the things that I've seen as a criticism of this book is that it doesn't really give NPC stat blocks. It depends on just giving you information about a character and giving reference to, for instance, an NPC stat block in one of the appendixes of the monster manual, and using that stat block as the stats for that particular character. Personally, I'm totally fine with that. And the Dark Lords themselves, they're also treated in that way. A lot of the Dark Lords, you're just referenced to say, hey, the recommended stat block is just a monster out of the monster manual, or an NPC stat block out of the monster manual. I want to kind of go back to the way Curse of Strahd was. In Curse of Strahd, Strahd is a vampire. And whenever I first read through Curse of Strahd book, I was looking at Strahd's stats, and I was like, these stats are just a vampire's stats. And then I got out my monster manual and started actually going through it line by line. And yes, for the vast majority of the stat block, Strahd is just a vampire. The only difference between Strahd and the vampire in the monster manual is Strahd is a level 8 or 9 caster. That is it. That is the sum total of the differences between the monster manual and the Curse of Strahd stats. And I'm completely fine with that. I'm fine with not having this big list of NPC stats filling up the book, taking up a lot of print space. Because whenever I'm GMing, the last thing I want to do is be flipping I'm already flipping between multiple books. I don't want to have to find that whichever Dark Lord I am using, I don't want to have it buried in the Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft on page 162 is where that particular stat block is, and completely separate from all of the other stat blocks that I am using, separate from the stat blocks that are accumulated at the end of the book in the new monsters section. To me, it's a lot more convenient just to have a modified version of an existing monster stats for the Dark Lords and for the NPCs. I can modify these stat blocks as I wish on a whim, and I don't have to worry about completely making up a character. It's not where I want to invest a lot of my time, and so I'm glad it is how it is in this book. And that's generally my stance on reprinting material. Like, I didn't like in Curse of Strahd, where Strahd was just a vampire with a few levels of caster. I would have preferred Strahd be mentioned in Curse of Strahd as just use a vampire stats and give him some spells. That would have been completely fine for me. I wouldn't have been disappointed. And I hate how sometimes material is reprinted from previous books. Whether or not I already own that book or not, I just feel like it's a waste of space to reprint information from one book to another. The next section is horror adventures, and this gives information on how to run a horror game and how to run a session 0 for your horror game. This is pretty similar to the information that is in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything about session 0, but thankfully it doesn't take up much print space. It's just 2 paragraphs in here, or I'm sorry, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs in here. But yeah, the session 0 information is good. Talks about discussing the genre, discussing campaign themes, and working together to create characters and choosing what optional rules to use and conveying that information to your players. And then we get into some nitty-gritty about how to run a horror session, how to run a horror adventure, how to pace, how to describe the horror. And this particular section, describing the horror, gives some really good advice that, in all honesty, should have been in the monster manual back in 5th edition, when 5th edition first came out. This describing monsters section should have been in the monster manual, because describing monsters has always been a rough thing for me to do. It's difficult for me to come up with a description on the fly, and this gives you some guidelines on how to do that. And especially for newer GMs, to have a framework of how to do that, I think is very, very useful. After that, there is some information about, there are some supplemental rules in here for using curses, and not just using the curse spell, but just how to make curses more interesting and make it an actual adventure in and of itself on how to get rid of a curse. There's rules in here for fear and stress, which really supplement the information that is given in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Some horror traps that are basically supernatural in origin, just to round out some traps that have appeared in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and I want to say Xanathar's Guide had some more information about traps, so this supplements it really nicely. Then we come to some rules about survivors, which are a special type of player character that is designed to be low level. This is essentially creating cannon fodder PCs for your player characters to play. You can use these ideas in a prelude. You can use these characters in a one-shot. You could do these characters in like some sort of informational flashback if you want to run that type of a game. To give some very, very simple characters that are kind of along, as far as complexity, they're kind of along the lines of a sidekick that was published in Tasha's, but had originally appeared on the Wizards of the Coast website. Then we get into an adventure, The House of Lament. I haven't read every bit of this adventure. It looks decent. I don't know how well it would play out, as I haven't had a chance to do it. It looks like it might be fun. My only complaint is that this adventure is designed for levels 1 to 3. My major complaint about this adventure is we already had a haunted house adventure designed for levels 1 to 3 that appeared in Curse of Strahd. This adventure plays out differently. It's a different type of haunted house, but just the fact that we've got your options for an introductory adventure into Ravenloft is either one haunted house or a different haunted house. I think that it makes it feel like there's not really a whole lot of options that are available for running a low-level game in a horror setting, and I feel like that kind of gives the wrong idea about what types of horror is available to the player characters, making it seem like there are certain types of stories that can only be played at certain tiers. And for horror, I absolutely do not believe that. Any horror adventure could be run at any level. The horror is not in the CR of the monster. The horror is in how everything comes together and just gives this feeling of unease and dread. After that adventure, we come to the Monsters of Ravenloft, the Bestiary. It gives some information on modifying existing monsters, making them personal, and if you're going to be using one of the Dark Lord suggested stats in this book, where they suggest you use a stat block from the monster manual, definitely give this section a read, as it gives some guidelines on how to customize a particular monster, especially for newer GMs. A lot of this information that I'm saying is for newer GMs. If you're an experienced GM, you should still read it. This is really good advice. Even if you're a good GM, even if you consider yourself a good GM, you're not going to remember all of this information every single time. So it's really nice to have some refreshers, because sometimes you realize that you've forgotten some really good tips that you have learned over the years. I know I have. There were some things that I read in this book that was like, oh yeah, I haven't done that in a long time. I really should start doing that again, or I should do that the next time I run a horror game, or why don't I do that anymore? And then we get into the specific monsters that are introduced here. I don't want to go over every single monster, but I do want to go over a couple of highlights that I was really happy to see in here. There is the 5th edition introduction of the Jiangshi, the Chinese hopping vampire or hopping zombie. They are introduced in here as they are associated with one of the domains of dread. There is the equivalent of the Headless Horseman in here, and this is absolutely a monster that can be plopped down into any campaign setting, and in order to give it a little bit of a Ravenloft feel, and you could give this monster a very small domain, like in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, where this long stretch of road is this domain of this dreadlord that is this Headless Horseman. And if you find yourself caught in it, it's a race to get to the bridge that marks, or whatever landmark marks the border of this particular monster. We also have a loup-garou, which is that's the French word for a werewolf, And in here, this creature is a beefed up werewolf. I want to say a werewolf in the monster manual is only a CR3. This is a little bit tougher at a CR13. So if you ever wanted to run a game based on Stephen King's The Cycle of the Werewolf, I'm absolutely using this monster for something like that. Or the werewolves in Curse of Strahd. If your player characters are pretty high level whenever they go there, absolutely make the leader of that pack one of these in order to put some terror into your characters. Because the Curse of Lycanthropy associated with this thing is appropriately a bit more dangerous and not as easy to remove as just casting a remove curse. So for a higher level party, yeah, bring that in. Have some fun. I also like the Relentless Killers. What is a Relentless Killer? This is a slasher movie villain. The Relentless Slasher is an absolute translation of Michael Myers into D&D 5th edition, and the Relentless Juggernaut is a translation of Jason Voorhees into D&D 5th edition. Can't wait to use those. And then next we have a Star Emissary. What's a Star Emissary? Think John Carpenter's The Thing. I absolutely want to have an adventure related to this monster as the capstone for a campaign. It's a freaking tough monster. It's a CR19 in its lesser form and a CR21 in its greater form. Definitely an end of the campaign style monster to go against. But hell, this would be fun to throw a bunch of low-level characters, a bunch of survivors from earlier in the game against this impossibly difficult monster. I just relish the idea of throwing a very high-level monster like this shape changer, against a low-level group. There's a few other monsters in here, but I'm not really going to go into them. As I was going through this, I noticed a change in the stat block. These stat blocks now have a space where it puts the proficiency bonus of the particular monster. It's something that I just noticed whenever I was going through this book. I hadn't noticed it in any of the previous books that I own. I think this is a brand new addition to D&D 5th edition stat blocks. I don't think it was in Tasha's, but I don't remember there being any big stat blocks in Tasha's. But I really like having the proficiency bonus explicitly stated right there in the stat block. So if you want to change it, or if you want to add any new powers to a particular monster, you have the proficiency bonus there, so you don't have to reverse engineer it from the stat block that was given. So, and then the very last page is a full page spread of the Spirit board, which is the Ravenloft equivalent of a Ouija board, whereas the Taraka deck was the Ravenloft equivalent of a tarot deck. Earlier in the book, it gives a little bit of information about using the Spirit board in an adventure, but there's really not information of how, it's a nice visual, but I would really like some information about how to use this organically in the game and have your players sit around the table and interact with this, where you could make a copy of it or print it out and actually have this as a prop in the game. I don't know how to actually use it besides just having it sit there and be nice. There's a little bit of information about the Taraka deck and what the different suits mean, but if you're not familiar with tarot, it doesn't give any information about how to interpret what is on the cards into your story. I feel like this book is only 256 pages. Compared to the other setting books, it's a little bit long. It's 100 pages longer than the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, and it is the same length as the Theros book, but it's shorter than the Eberron book, and it's shorter than the Wildemount book. And at $50 US dollars, this book costs the same as the Eberron book. The Eberron book was 320 pages. Same cost. 60 pages longer the Eberron book was. I would like to have had a little bit more content, but for what it is, I feel like particularly for game masters, the Van Richten book, the Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, is a very good addition to D&D. If you are at all interested in running horror games for 5th edition or potentially for any game, it's got a lot of really good information. If you have a bunch of other horror games, the information might be duplicated. But if you don't own a bunch of other game systems, if you don't own World of Darkness, or you don't own Call of Cthulhu or any of the other horror role-playing games, this is a very good primer on how to run those types of games. It gives a lot of really good information. Yeah, I recommend that if you're a GM and interested in expanding your D&D library, definitely pick this book up. If you're a player, I don't know if I could recommend this book. If you're solely a player, just to have the 3 lineages, the 2 subclasses, and the handful of backgrounds, it's really not worth it. I don't feel like it's worth it for a player. If you are a player and you want this information, I might just recommend you pay for it on D&D Beyond. Other than that, yeah, very solid book. Would recommend. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the episode here. There's not going to be a geek thing, as my geek thing is Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. Thank you very much for listening. Time for me to stop this bullshit and start designing my next game. Thank you. Bye.
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution, no derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.